Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Deku married to Princess Sally Acorn and became king? Subscribe if you enjoy the video. And also check the description. So let's begin the story. The city of Midoriya had seen better mornings. It had seen worse ones too. Izuku Midoriya knew this, had catalogued them in the worn pages of notebooks going back to childhood, cross-referenced by villain class, property damage radius, and civilian casualty estimates. But there was something particularly grim about a Tuesday that began with a 14-block evacuation and a villain who appeared, by all observable evidence, to have fused himself with a particle accelerator. His name, according to the file Uraraka had pulled up on her phone 40 seconds ago and was still trying to read aloud over the sound of collapsing infrastructure, was Kaido Shima, also known by his villain handle Aperture. The file said he was 31 years old, formerly a research physicist at Keio University, now classified as a rank A threat with a quirk that allowed him to generate and sustain spatial tears, localized punctures in physical space through which he could redirect force, projectiles, and apparently, entire sections of Midoriya's downtown rail corridor. What the file had not mentioned, and what no prior encounter had apparently thought worth documenting, was that Aperture had recently gotten hold of a quirk amplification device. The black market kind, the ones that had been flooding in from the remnants of the League of Villains supply network since the fall. And that when you fed an already dangerous spatial manipulation quirk through 15 times its natural bandwidth, the resulting tears in space were not the polite, person-sized portals of prior incident reports. They were the size of city buses. They were hungry. And they moved. Deku! Uraraka's voice cut through the roar of displaced air. The gap on the left is closing. If you're going to pull Takahashi-san out, you have to go now. Izuku was already moving. He had been running at 45% of One for All's output. Careful, calibrated. The product of years of work with Gran Torino and Sir Nightai's old training regiments. But the moment he clocked the structural beam about to come down across the mouth of the subway exit where a middle-aged man in a business suit was frozen in panic, he bumped it to 60 and felt the familiar crackling surge of green lightning fork across his skin like a second skeleton. The concrete hit the spot where he'd been standing 0.3 seconds after he left it. He was already at the exit, one arm hooked under Takahashi-san's shoulders, the other braced against the frame of the door as the ceiling groaned above them. "I've got you," Izuku said, and his voice was steady in the way that mattered, not because he wasn't scared, but because he had learned, somewhere in the gap between being a quirkless kid who cried over hero videos and being the man currently holding a stranger's life in his arms, that his fear was not the part that needed to be loud. "Hold on to me. Don't look up. Don't let go." Takahashi-san grabbed his hero costume with both fists and did not let go. Izuku launched them both out of the subway exit in a single bound, tucked his charge against his chest, rolled across the evacuated street to bleed their velocity, and had the man on his feet and pointed at the triage station 3 blocks east before the dust had finished settling from the collapsed entrance behind them. "Go," Izuku said. "There are heroes at the orange barrier. You'll be safe there." Takahashi-san looked at him with the expression Izuku had never entirely gotten used to. That raw, shaking, unmediated gratitude that lived in the space between almost dying and actually not, and then ran, stumbling but running, toward the barrier. Izuku turned back to the fight. Aperture was hovering 50 meters above street level, suspended in the updraft from his own largest tear, a churning, lightless wound in the air roughly 8 meters across that had swallowed the top 2 floors of an office building and was in the process of spitting them back out somewhere over the bay. The amplification device was strapped across his chest like a bandolier of glowing canisters, each one feeding energy into his quirk in a way that made the air around him ripple as though reality itself was developing a migraine. Todoroki was on the north approach, throwing ice pillars to wall off the collapse zone. Bakugo was hitting Aperture from the southeast in short, explosive bursts, trying to break his concentration without giving him a stable target to redirect. Ida was managing civilian evacuation on the western perimeter. Uraraka was, Izuku scanned, found her, on the roof of the parking structure, coordinating with 2 rescue heroes and using her quirk to float debris away from trapped civilians below. Good. They were doing everything right. They were heroes, and they were good at it. But Aperture was still up there, and the tears were multiplying. Izuku counted 6 now. 6 active spatial rifts of varying sizes, drifting at low altitude through what had been a reasonably pleasant Tuesday morning in downtown Musurifu. The largest was still growing. The amplification device was the problem. As long as Aperture had it, suppressing him was a losing game. You could knock him around all you liked, but the device would keep feeding power into the tiers even if he was unconscious. They needed to get it off him. Izuku pulled up his earpiece. Kaken. A 1-second pause. Then what? The canisters on his chest. They're the source. If we can crack the housing without triggering a cascade detonation, obviously. The irritation in Bakugo's voice was pure reflex, the kind that no longer had any real edge behind it after years of working together. I've been trying to get a clean shot for 6 minutes. He keeps redirecting my blasts. He's tracking the heat signature, Izuku said. He'd been watching. He redirects anything that reads as high energy. We need something he won't see as a threat until it's already there. A pause. Then, despite himself, what are you thinking, nerd? Izuku was already in motion. Get him looking at you. Big, loud, lots of fire. Give me 40 seconds. He didn't wait for Bakugo's answer, which arrived in the form of an explosion so large and aggressively theatrical that 3 pigeons and a traffic drone immediately retreated to the next ward over. Aperture spun toward it. His 3 leftmost tiers spun with him, tracking the threat. Izuku went right, low, fast, hugging the shadow of the building line at 70%, then 80%. He felt the familiar warmth of one for all spreading through him, the deep electric hum of a quirk that had been passed down through 8 people before him, each of them a hero, each of them someone who had looked at the worst things in the world and decided to run toward them. He hit 90% at the apex of his jump and everything slowed down the way it always did at these speeds, the world going granular and precise, each particle of dust caught mid-fall, each crack in the concrete a road map, Aperture's position and orientation a solved equation. He had maybe 2 seconds in the villain's blind spot. Maybe. He aimed his wrist brace between 2 fingers. Delaware smash! The compressed shockwave hit the amplification device dead center. For a moment, a fraction of a second that contained an entire universe of possibility, Izuku thought it had worked. The housing cracked. Several of the canisters went dark. Aperture screamed, more in shock than pain, and lurched sideways in the air. And then the 3 remaining active canisters, thrown into unstable resonance by the shockwave, sent a pulse of energy into the largest tier that was nothing like anything any incident report had ever described. Because the tier did not redirect force, and it did not spit debris into the bay, and it did not close. It expanded. The sound it made had no real precedent in Izuku's experience. It was not loud exactly. It was the opposite of loud, a sudden, total absence of background noise, as though someone had pressed mute on the world. And then the air rushed inward all at once, a massive, roaring exhalation in reverse, and the tier was everywhere. A yawning lightless mouth that had gone from 8 meters to 30 in the span of a blink. Izuku had time to think. The edge calculations are wrong, I'm going to. And then Uraraka's scream, his name in her voice, from very far away. And then nothing. There was green. Not the green of his lightning, not the neon and chrome green of hero districts at night. This was a different green entirely. Layered and dense and alive in a way that urban green never quite managed. The green of things that had been growing for a very long time without anyone asking them to stop. Izuku hit it face first and discovered, in the first clear thought he had managed since the rift swallowed him, that it was a tree. More specifically, he had passed through whatever impossible spatial event had claimed him, apparently traveled an indeterminate distance through something that was not space as he understood it, and deposited himself into the canopy of a tree that was large enough and old enough to make the trees in Dagoba Municipal Beach Park look like houseplants. He had punched through 3 layers of branches on the way down, which had slowed him enough that the landing, on a root structure the approximate size and geometry of a small car, was survivable, if not what anyone would call comfortable. He lay very still for a moment, cataloging his body the way Gran Torino had taught him years ago. Ribs. 3 of them, bruised but not broken, protesting with every breath. Right arm. The one he'd used for the Delaware smash, already compromised, now contributing a new and creative array of sensations to the general landscape of his discomfort. Left arm, functional. Legs, functional. Head, present and accounted for. though the part of him that had grown up reading hero physiology breakdowns noted that he should not rule out concussion. Everything hurting. But present. He pushed himself upright, one arm at a time, and looked around. He was in a forest. That was the first fact. The second fact was that the forest was not anywhere he had ever been or, he was increasingly certain, anywhere that existed in any prefecture of Japan. The trees were enormous and ancient in a way that suggested old-growth temperate forests, but the quality of the light filtering through the canopy was subtly wrong, richer somehow, more saturated at the edges, as though the atmosphere itself had slightly different optical properties than the one he'd grown up breathing. The underbrush was dense and varied and full of sounds, birdsong, probably, insect noise, probably, and at least 2 calls he couldn't place at all, low and resonant, coming from somewhere to the northeast. The third fact was that there was no city. No ambient light pollution smearing the horizon, no distant traffic hum, no towers. Just forest, in every direction, as far as he could see through the trees. The fourth fact, and this one arrived with a specific quality of cold settling in his stomach, the feeling of a variable in an equation that shouldn't be there, was that there were 2 moons. They were both visible in the slice of sky above the gap his descent had torn through the canopy. One was large and familiar, roughly the right size and the right shade of pale. The other was smaller and slightly blue-tinted and orbiting at an angle that made the back of Izuku's brain perform a series of calculations it did not want to deliver results for. He sat on the root for a long moment and breathed. 2 moons. He was not in Japan. He was, in all likelihood, not anywhere he had ever read about or trained for or been briefed on by any hero agency's threat assessment database. The rift had not redirected him. It had not moved him through space. It had moved him through something else. He pressed his earpiece. Static. He tried again. More static. He checked his phone. No signal. Screen cracked. Compass spinning in lazy circles that suggested the device had as little idea where it was as he did. He put the phone away and did what All Might, and Gran Torino, and his mother, and Aizawa-sensei in his own particular fashion, had all taught him in their own particular ways. He stopped. He breathed. He thought. He was alive. He was mobile. He was not being actively threatened. He had food in his utility belt, 2 protein bars and an emergency glucose pack, a small first aid kit, and whatever remained of his quirk's output after the strain of the fight and the fall. He tested it carefully, generated a small pulse of 1 for all at around 15%, and felt it respond, tired but present. He had his training, which was comprehensive. He had his mind, which was, even now, already working. The forest was his first problem and his first resource. He needed higher ground to assess his surroundings. He needed water within the next 12 hours. He needed to understand what this place was before he made any moves that couldn't be taken back. He was beginning to climb, methodically, testing each branch, 1 for all kept at a conservative 10% to help with grip, when he heard voices. The thing about combat training was that it taught you to hear. Not just the obvious sounds, footsteps, machinery, the crack of something structural giving way, but the subtler ones, the background sounds that shifted and changed and told you things about what was coming before your eyes could. Aizawa-sensei had drilled this into all of them over 3 years of UA, and Gran Torino had reinforced it with a particular training method that Izuku still occasionally had nightmares about. He heard the voices at roughly 40 meters. He made out at least 4 distinct sources. They were moving with purpose rather than speed, not running, but not the aimless wander of people who weren't going anywhere. He heard what sounded like a gadget or device of some kind, occasional electronic chirps interspersed with the voices. He did not hear anything that sounded like the 6 active spatial tiers he had last seen devastating downtown Muzurifu. He climbed down from the tree and positioned himself behind the root structure, which was large enough to provide genuine cover, and waited. They came into view through a gap in the undergrowth, and Izuku, who had trained himself, over years, to process surprising visual information without reacting visibly, because heroes operated in a world that regularly presented genuinely surprising visual information, managed to contain his reaction to a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. They were not human. More precisely, they were and they weren't. They were bipedal, and they moved with the body language of people rather than animals, the gestures, the posture, the spacing between individuals that spoke to social relationships and established hierarchy. Two of them appeared to be arguing in the comfortable, long-running way of people who had been arguing the same argument for a while and no longer expected it to resolve. But they were, he took them in, rapid, detailed, cataloging automatically the way he couldn't help doing even in the strangest moments. They were animals. Or something between animal and person, something that had no category in any text Izuku had ever read. The one in front was a blue hedgehog. He was short. Izuku's height estimates put him around 4 feet, and moving with a loose-limbed, easy confidence that told Izuku everything he needed to know about how this individual moved through the world. Fast. Probably faster than anything nearby, aware of it, comfortable with that awareness. He wore red shoes that were unusual enough to have been designed for a purpose, and his expression as he scanned the forest had the quality of someone who was always expecting something to come at him, and planning 3 responses in advance. Behind him, and clearly the source of at least one half of the ongoing argument, was a young woman. Izuku's breath caught again, for reasons that were different from the 2 moons reason. He processed this in the same methodical way he processed everything, which did not make the processing any less vivid. A squirrel, or something in the general family of squirrel, her fur a warm brown with cream at the face and forearms. She was taller than the hedgehog and moved differently, with a deliberate, considered precision that reminded Izuku, unexpectedly, of the way Yaoyorozu moved in the field, like someone who was always doing 4 things at once, and had long since made peace with that. She was wearing practical field clothing, vest, boots, equipment harness, and she held a small device that she occasionally glanced at in a manner that suggested navigational or tactical use. There was something else about her, something in the way the others oriented to her even when she was speaking and not leading, that read clearly to Izuku's trained perception as authority. Not the authority of volume or force. The quieter kind. The kind that didn't need to announce itself. Behind her, a small orange fox, 2 tails, Izuku clocked automatically, and spent a quarter of a second being fascinated before returning his attention to the whole picture, who couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 and was watching the forest around them with a focused, technical attention that seemed more suited to someone 3 times his age. And behind the fox, 2 others, one in a cape and armor who was managing his concern about the forest somewhat less successfully than everyone else, and one large one, a bear or something similarly built, who was carrying what looked like a toolkit and making careful notes on a piece of paper. 5 of them. Moving tactically through old-growth forest. Wearing equipment that suggested they'd been doing this for a while, and had built the equipment themselves. The small device in the woman's hand chirped. She stopped walking. And because Izuku had very little ability to lie to himself about these things, he acknowledged, in the clear-eyed private accounting of his own cognition, that when she stopped walking she stopped directly in line with his position behind the root, and her eyes, sharp, brown, careful, had found the specific section of undergrowth where he was hiding. She was very still for exactly 2 seconds, then she said quietly, to the hedgehog, "We're not alone." The hedgehog did not appear to be surprised. He had already turned, and his posture had changed, not quite a fighting stance, but close to it. The kind of ready but not committed position that a very fast individual adopted when they were waiting to see whether they needed to fight. "Yeah, I got that about 20 seconds ago. Was starting to wonder if you'd catch up." The woman did not visibly react to this. "Identify yourselves." She was speaking directly to the root structure. "We're aware of your position. If you're a robotic spy, I'd recommend you think carefully about your next move. If you're not, then there's no reason for either of us to make this more difficult than it needs to be." Her voice was steady and clear and had that quality Izuku had come to associate with people who were accustomed to authority. Not raised, not aggressive, but with a certainty to it that suggested she was genuinely not concerned about whether you would comply. She expected compliance, not because she was demanding it, but because she had assessed the situation and determined it was the most reasonable outcome. Izuku stood up. He did it slowly and deliberately, hands visible, one for all released entirely, making himself as non-threatening as a 6-foot teenager in a partially damaged hero costume could manage to be. He stepped out from behind the root and stood in the gap between the trees and said, "I'm not a spy. I don't actually know where I am. My name is Izuku Midoriya. I'm a pro-hero from Japan. I came through a spatial rift during a villain attack and I think I might be very far from home. There was a silence. The hedgehog stared at him. It's a human. Yes, the woman said, with the tone of someone taking a note rather than making an observation. A human. With lightning coming off him. Did anyone else see that? Was that a thing that happened? He released it before he stepped out, the fox said, with the focused attentiveness of a specialist. The charge pattern was dissipating. I think it's generated rather than ambient. Some kind of biological energy output. Yeah, Tails, not the most pressing thing right now, Sonic. One word from the woman, and the hedgehog, Sonic, closed his mouth. She was looking at Izuku with an expression he couldn't quite read. It was not hostile. It was not particularly warm. It was the expression of someone running a rapid assessment, weighing something behind their eyes, making a series of calls too fast to track individually. A spatial rift, she said. What caused it? A villain with a spatial manipulation quirk, a power, and an amplification device, Izuku said. He was working to keep his voice even and informative, because he had the strong sense that what this person would respond to best was honesty and clarity, and he didn't have anything to hide anyway. We were trying to neutralize him. I damaged the device. It seems to have caused a cascade event instead of shutting it down. The rift opened much larger than any of the previous ones and I went through it. He paused. I didn't mean to, clearly, she said. Are you injured? Some bruising and a partially damaged arm. Nothing critical. Can you walk? Yes. She considered him for another moment. I'm Sally Acorn, she said. These are Sonic, Tails, Antoine, and Rotor. She did not elaborate on who they were or what they were doing, which Izuku found interesting. She gave names, not titles, as though that were sufficient. We're in the Great Forest, approximately 11 kilometers from our base of operations. You're going to have questions. I have questions. I'd prefer we exchange answers somewhere that isn't an open forest where we've been stationary for too long. She glanced at the device in her hand. Can you keep pace with a ground march, or do you need to stop? Izuku thought about his ribs, his arm, the general state of his body after a villain fight and an interdimensional transit. I can keep pace, he said. She nodded once, turned, and began walking. The group fell in around her without being told to, and Izuku, after a moment that contained the entirety of the strangeness of his situation, the forest, the two moons still visible through the canopy, the impossible fact of where and when and with whom he was standing, followed. Sonic dropped back to walk beside him, watching him with a sideways glance that was doing its best to look casual and not quite managing it. Up close, Izuku could see that the hedgehog was younger than his demeanor suggested. 14, maybe 15. Old eyes on a young face, the specific kind of old that came from taking on too much too soon. Izuku recognized it. He'd seen it in the mirror. Lightning guy, Sonic said. Midoriya, Izuku said. Or Deku, that's my hero name, Deku. Sonic turned this over. That means something? It means, it's complicated. It started as an insult. Now it means something else. Sonic was quiet for a moment. You said you're a pro-hero. Like that's a job? Being a hero? In my world, yes. There are licensing systems. Agencies. Hero rankings. Izuku hesitated then, because it was true and relevant, and he didn't want to start whatever this was with omissions, added, I've been a pro-hero for about a year. Before that I was in a hero training program. I was assigned to a patrol sector in Mizurufu when the call came in about Aperture, the villain. So you're new. Relatively. Sonic seemed to be deciding something. We don't have heroes here, he said. Not like that. Not with, the jobs and the agencies. We have. He made a gesture that took in the group around them, the forest, the whole evidence situation. This. Which is not a job. Trust me. What is it? Izuku asked. Sonic looked at him, and for a moment the studied coolness dropped, and what was underneath was simpler and more raw. The face of someone who had been fighting for a very long time and was tired in the way that didn't go away with sleep. It's just what we do, he said. Someone has to. Izuku knew that feeling so well it almost hurt. He said very quietly, yeah? Sonic looked away and picked up his pace. They walked for an hour and a half. Izuku catalogued everything. He catalogued the forest, the plant species, unclassifiable, but the ecological relationships between them followed familiar logic. The soil type, rich, loamy, well-watered, the wildlife sounds, numerous, active, suggesting a healthy and relatively undisturbed ecosystem. He catalogued the group's movement patterns, Sonic ranging ahead and returning at intervals, the fox he'd been introduced as Tails staying close to the device carrying one named Rotor and occasionally pointing at things Rotor would note down, the one named Antoine maintaining a rearguard position with studied vigilance, Sally Acorn walking at the center of the group's formation with the specific quality of stillness that experienced commanders had in motion, always scanning, always 3 decisions ahead. He catalogued the scars in the landscape. They appeared first as small things, a section of undergrowth that was growing back from the outside, the kind of regrowth pattern that suggested it had been cleared or burned, then left. Then larger things, the skeleton of what might once have been a building, deep in the trees, now so thoroughly reclaimed by vegetation it was more impression than structure, 3 walls and a ghost of a floor and nothing else. Then, as they got closer to whatever destination they were heading toward, the faint, intermittent sound of machinery, very distant, in a direction that everyone in the group was carefully not looking at. "What's that way?" Izuku asked Tails, who had fallen into a natural orbit near him, the technical curiosity in the young fox's eyes apparently overriding whatever caution his companions were exercising. Tails looked in the direction Izuku had indicated. His expression shifted, something guarded dropping over the natural openness of his face. "Robotropolis," he said. That's where Dr. Robotnik is, where he works from. We try not to get too close without a specific mission." "Robotnik," Izuku said. He filed the name. He filed the way Tails said it, with the flatness of a word that had been spoken so many times, in so many bad contexts, that the emotional valence had been worn down to something hard and featureless. He'd heard that flatness before, in the way people from Kamino Ward talked about the Nomu attack. "How long has he been there?" "My whole life," Tails said. "Longer, but for me, my whole life." Izuku looked at him. "How old are you?" 8, Tails said, with the particular dignity of someone who had heard the follow-up question before and was preemptively answering it. "I know I seem older. Sonic says it's because I never stopped working." He paused. "He says it like it's a criticism, but I think it's just an observation." Despite everything, Izuku smiled. "You remind me of someone I used to be." Tails looked at him with those focused, intelligent eyes. "Used to be? I grew up a little." "Oh." Tails considered this. Was it worth it? Izuku thought about that honestly. He thought about Kaken and Uraraka and Todoroki and the rest of their class, about Aizawa-sensei and All Might in his weakened state, about his mother crying at hero videos, about a rooftop in Kamino, and the thing All Might had said before the whole world changed. He thought about a lot of things, standing in a forest on what was almost certainly not his planet, with an 8-year-old fox who had been fighting for his whole life. "Yes," he said. "And no." "Both, I think." Tails nodded, apparently satisfied with this, and returned to his conversation with Rotor. Knothole Village announced itself not with a gate or a clearing but with a smell, something cooking, wood smoke. The particular warm complexity of a place where people were eating and working and being alive in the same space. And then, suddenly, the trees parted and it was there. It was not large. Izuku's first thought was that it was built the way heroes designed evacuation protocols, efficiently, every element serving a specific function, no wasted space. Structures of wood and packed earth, set back into the treeline, their roofs shaped to catch and channel rainwater. A central fire pit with multiple cooking stations, what looked like a workshop, its door open to the afternoon light, the sound of tools and the smell of machine oil drifting out. Gardens, actual gardens, productive and carefully tended, which told him more about the permanence and planning of this place than anything else. These were people who had been here long enough to grow things, to commit to a future in this specific location. But what hit him hardest was the people. There were others, not many, perhaps 30 or 40, and they were, like the group he'd come with, human-shaped and animal in nature. A rabbit hanging laundry between 2 structures. An armadillo cross-referencing 2 clipboards with the deep concentration of someone managing a supply problem. A group of younger ones, children clearly, the way all children were children regardless of species, playing some running game in the space between two buildings. All of them living, all of them moving around this small, hidden space with the matter-of-fact competence of people who had built something under difficult circumstances and were committed to keeping it. "Welcome to Knothole," Sally Acorn said, from his right. She had appeared beside him at some point in the last few minutes without him noticing, which impressed him despite himself. "Thank you," he said. "It's remarkable. It's home," she said, with something in her voice that was not simple. It was the way you said home when the word contained a history you didn't always want to explain. He recognized that too. She was looking at the village with an expression that told him something important. She was not just a leader here. She was something else, something older and more complicated. He had met enough people in UA and the Hero Commission who wore their role like a costume to recognize when someone wore it like skin. "You called yourself a princess," he said. He'd been turning this over since she'd said her name. "Sally Acorn. Is that a family name or both?" she said. "My father is, the king of this land. The kingdom of Acorn. Robotnik overthrew him 5 years ago." She said it with the same flatness Tails had used for the villain's name, not because it didn't matter. Because it mattered so much that the feelings around it had been stored somewhere else, somewhere functional and quiet, so they didn't get in the way of the work. "He's in the zone of silence now. We're trying to get him back. Among other things." "Among other things," Izuku repeated. "There's a long list." She glanced at him, and for a moment something shifted in her expression, not warmth exactly, but the precursor to it, the willingness to look at someone clearly and let them look back. "Yours probably begins with figuring out how to get you home." "Yes," he said. "Although," he stopped. "Although?" He thought about the rift. About the cascade event. About the fact that dimensional spatial tears were not, as far as anyone in his world had documented, a consistent or reversible phenomenon. He thought about the 2 moons. He thought about the forest and the village and the 30-kilometer distance sound of a tyrant's machinery. "Although I'd like to help while I'm here," he said. "If that's allowed? If it's useful." Sally looked at him for a long moment. He got the sense that she was doing what she always did, running the calculus, assessing variables, making a call, and that the process was thorough enough to be worth waiting for. "Let's see what you've got first," she said. "Then we'll talk about useful." She walked into the village, and after a moment Izuku followed her. Behind him, he heard Sonic say to Tails, very quietly, "Did she just?" "Yes," Tails said. "Huh." Izuku kept walking, and watched the village settle around him like something that was making room, and tried not to think too hard about the 2 moons overhead, or about the 12,000 kilometers and whatever unfathomable additional distance separated him from his mother's apartment, and his friends and the city he'd sworn to protect. He was here. He was alive. There were people who needed help. He knew what that meant. He had always known. He pulled a new notebook from his utility belt, cracked spine, green cover, 3rd one this year, and began to write. Sally Acorn's private journal, entry undated. He writes things down. Everything. Before we were even inside Knothole's perimeter he had a notebook out and was taking notes on the architecture, the gardens, the faces of people he'd just met. I watched him note the workshop's chimney angle, south-facing, good for drafting, the height of the food stores off the ground, flood-proofing, he told Rotor later, unprompted, and the fact that Antoine's cape snags on his sword hilt when he walks uphill. He is not what I expected a human from another world to be. I expected confusion. He's curious instead. I expected fear. He's managing it. Badly, I think. It's in the set of his shoulders when he thinks no one is looking, but managing it. He fights like someone who genuinely believes in people. I don't know what to do with that yet. More tomorrow. Back in Muzurifu, the emergency response took 11 minutes to fully contain Aperture's remaining spatial tears, which closed naturally once the amplification device had been sufficiently damaged, shutting down, one by one, like lights going out in an office at the end of a long day. They found Izuku's hero costume piece, a single wrist brace, torn clean off, lying on the asphalt at the exact edge of where the largest rift had been, 40 minutes into the search. Uraraka was the one who found it. She had been working the search grid in disciplined quadrants, not allowing herself to stop moving because she knew what stopping would mean, what her body would do if she let it stop. And she found the brace and she knelt down on the asphalt with it in both hands, and she was very still for a long moment. Then she stood up, flagged down the response coordinator, and kept working. Todoroki called it in on the hero's channel with his usual economy of language. Item recovered. No body. The rift may have been a transit event rather than a destructive one. He paused, and what came next was not what anyone who knew Todoroki only professionally would have expected from him. He could be somewhere. Not gone. Somewhere. In the emergency response tent, Bakugo received this information with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and his eyes very bright, and he said nothing, which was its own kind of information. The official status designation, filed 6 hours later with the Hero Public Safety Commission, was Midoriya. Izuku status, missing, incident classification 7, spatial/dimensional incident. Search and recovery operations ongoing. In a small apartment in Shizuoka, Inko Midoriya sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold and read the status report that had been delivered by a very careful, very gentle government liaison who had not quite met her eyes when he handed it to her. She read it twice. She folded it. She looked out her kitchen window at the small garden she kept, the one Izuku had helped her plant 2 summers ago, and she thought, he is somewhere. Somewhere there are stars and he is underneath them and he is trying to figure out what to do next. She knew her son. She put on the kettle for fresh tea and began, very methodically, to figure out who she needed to call. Naoto went quiet at a different hour than a city. There was no gradual dimming of electric lights, no traffic noise tapering towards silence. Instead, the village moved through a kind of natural decompression, voices dropping, fires banking, the last few people moving between structures becoming fewer and then none, and arrived at a stillness that was not empty but full, the full quiet of a forest at night, alive with everything that lived in the dark. Izuku could not sleep. He had been given a small structure at the edge of the residential cluster, barely large enough for a sleeping platform and a low table, but clean and solid, with a window that faced the tree line. He sat on the sleeping platform with his knees to his chest and his back against the wall, and watched the 2 moons track across the gap in the canopy outside the window and thought. He thought about his mother. He thought about Uraraka, who had screamed his name, and whether she had been hurt in the aftermath of the Cascade event. He thought about Bakugo, who would be furious, which was how Bakugo processed fear. He thought about Todoroki, who would be quiet and systematic about looking, which was how Todoroki processed everything. He thought about Aizawa-sensei, who had invested what he was careful never to call affection, but which clearly was affection in the students of 1A, and what it cost a man like that to have one of his people go missing. He thought about All Might, who he had not told enough times that he was grateful. He thought about the rift, the physics of it, the cascade dynamics, whether it was theoretically reversible, whether there was any framework in his world's understanding of quirks and their amplification mechanics that might let someone reach back through to where he'd come from. He thought about whether there was an equivalent framework in this world, whatever this world was, and what it might look like, and whether the small device Sally Acorn had been carrying in the forest had any relevant capability he hadn't identified yet. He thought about Sally Acorn. He stopped thinking about Sally Acorn, because that was not a productive direction, and he had enough to process. He opened his notebook, the new one, green cover, already filling with the rapid angular scrawl of someone who thought faster than they could write, and turned to the page where he'd been building his initial picture of the situation. He read through what he had. He added things. He drew a rough map of Knothole as best he could reconstruct it, with notes on the structures and their likely functions. He drew diagrams of the group's movement formation in the forest, annotated with observations about individual roles and competencies. He drew a small, quick sketch of the village at the moment he'd first seen it, the gardens, the workshop, the children playing. He was not a good artist. He had never been a good artist, but he drew it anyway, because he had learned that there were things worth recording even if the recording was imperfect. He was on his 4th page of notes, when he heard footsteps outside. He recognized them. He had been cataloging the group's movement patterns all afternoon, and those particular footsteps had a specific rhythm, deliberate and light, the footsteps of someone who moved with precision even when they thought no one was listening. He did not look up immediately. He waited until she knocked on the door frame. One knock, not an intrusion, just an announcement. And then he closed the notebook and said, "Come in." Sally Acorn stood in the doorway with 2 cups. She was out of her field equipment, wearing something simpler and less tactical, which somehow made her seem both more approachable and more herself. She held up one of the cups in a small gesture of offering. "I was making tea," she said. "It seemed, I don't know. It seemed like you might not be sleeping." "I'm not," Izuku said. "Thank you." She came in and sat on the edge of the low table, the only other surface in the small space, and they were quiet for a moment, both holding their cups. The forest doing its nighttime business outside the window. "Nicole ran some diagnostics when you were eating dinner," Sally said. Nicole, Izuku had gathered, was the device, or something inside it, or both. He needed to understand this better. "On the energy signature of the rift you came through. The residual readings in the Great Forest. And, she says there's a faint trace. Not enough to tell us anything definitive about stability or location, but enough to know the rift was a real event, not a quirk illusion or a misperception." She looked at him steadily. "You really are from somewhere else." "I really am." He paused. "Were you not sure?" "I was about 70% sure," she said. "I try not to go to 100% on anything I can't verify independently." Izuku nodded. He understood this. He realized, respected it. "What's the other 30%? The other 30% was the possibility that Robotnik had found a new approach to infiltration. He's tried several." She said this not as an accusation. There was no suspicion left in her tone now, but as information, the way you shared relevant operational context with someone you decided to give a provisional trust. "We've had agents who were convinced they were on our side right up until they weren't." "I understand," Izuku said. "I don't blame you for checking." She looked at him for a moment, and something shifted in her expression, not dramatically. She didn't seem like a person who did things dramatically, but the shift was there. "Most people, when I say something like that, take offense," she said. "I'm a hero," Izuku said. "We get deceived sometimes. It's part of the job. Being careful isn't an insult, it's operational sense." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, what is being a hero like? In your world?" It was the question he least expected, and so it hit him differently than the questions he'd been preparing for. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. "It's the best and worst thing I've ever done," he said. "Which is saying something, because I also went through UA, which is a competitive hero school that includes things like being attacked by real villains in your first year as part of the curriculum." He paused. "Probably I shouldn't have said that last part. It sounds like your world has significant issues with how it trains the people responsible for public safety," Sally said mildly. Izuku laughed, an actual, surprised laugh, the first one he managed since the rift. "You know, Uraraka says something similar. She phrases it differently, but the substance is the same." His voice caught very slightly on the name, and he covered it, but she noticed. He could tell she noticed. "Who is Uraraka?" she asked. She's one of my closest friends. She's a hero too. She was there when the rift opened." He looked at his hands. "She'll be looking for me." "They all will." "We'll look too," Sally said. "Nicole will keep monitoring. If there's a signal, we'll find it." "Thank you." They were quiet again. It was a different quiet than before, not tentative, but settled. The kind of quiet between two people who had established something small and true and were taking a moment to sit with it. "Can I ask you something?" Izuku said. "Yes." "The children playing this afternoon, in the village. They live here? Full time?" "Yes," she said. "We can't send them anywhere else. Robotnik's forces control most of the territory beyond the forest, so they've grown up here. In this village, in this forest, without going anywhere. Without seeing much beyond." "Yes," she said again. Her voice was even, but he heard something underneath it. "That's not your fault," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. "I know," she said finally, and he could tell from the way she said it that it was true and also that it didn't help much. "I know it intellectually. The emotional calculus is less clean." "I know what you mean." She looked at him. "Do you?" He thought about Kamino Ward. He thought about the overhaul raid, and the child at the center of it, and the weight of that, which he still carried and probably always would. He thought about all the ways a hero, even a good one, even one trying their hardest, was always one decision away from a consequence they would have to live with. Yes, he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment, and what he saw in her expression, briefly, before the composure returned, was something raw and genuine and exhausted. The face of someone who had been carrying things for a long time and almost never put them down. Then she stood, collected her cup, and said, "Get some sleep, Midoriya. Tomorrow will have things in it." "It usually does," he said. She almost smiled. He could see it not quite happen at the corner of her expression. "Almost a joke," she said. Good night, he said. She left, and the forest filled the space she'd vacated with its usual steady nighttime voice. And Izuku lay back on the sleeping platform and looked at the two moons through his window and thought about a lot of things, and eventually, somewhere past the second moon's arc and before the dawn, he slept. Izuku woke before dawn. This was not unusual. He had been waking before dawn since his second year at UA, when Aizawa-sensei had restructured the class's physical training schedule and the early hours had become the only reliable time to fit in the additional solo work that Izuku's particular approach to improvement demanded. His body had adjusted so thoroughly to the new schedule that it no longer required an alarm. It simply woke him in the gray, pre-light hour before the world committed to being a day, regular as a tide. What was unusual was that when he opened his eyes, the ceiling above him was wood instead of the water-stained plaster of the apartment he'd been renting in Muzudafa since getting his provisional license, and the sound beyond his window was not the ambient urban frequency of a city doing its early morning business but the deep, layered quiet of a living forest at the hinge between night and day. He lay still for a moment, as he had the morning of the UA Sports Festival, the morning of the Kamino operation, and any number of other mornings that had turned out to be significant, the kind of stillness in which you let the reality of your circumstances settle into you completely before you got up and started dealing with them. Then he got up and started dealing with them. His uniform was damaged but wearable. The right arm was worse than he'd acknowledged yesterday, not dangerous, but the bruising had deepened overnight into a vivid purple-green that would have earned a lecture from Recovery Girl, who he suspected, with a pang, was currently several impossible distances away and probably also worried. He bandaged it from his kit, less efficiently than Recovery Girl would have liked, and noted the limitations it would place on Delaware Smash variants until it healed. He could work around it. He had worked around worse. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote, at the top, in the neat print he used for new operational contexts, Day 2. Mobius, Provisional Designation, Known Threats, Dr. Robotnik, Machinery-based authoritarian control, roboticization, unknown mechanism, requires urgent documentation, known assets, freedom fighters, sonic, speed quirk equivalent, unknown ceiling, Sally Acorn, strategic command, technological access via Nicole, Tails, engineering/technical, age 8, exceptional, Antoine, combat trained, morale function, rotor, mechanics and applied engineering. Current status. Rift origin site located in Great Forest. Dimensional trace confirmed via Nicole. Return probability unknown. Time horizon unknown. He underlined unknown twice. Then he added, primary objective while present, be useful. Secondary objective, do not be a burden. Tertiary objective, figure out roboticization. He paused, tapped his pen against the page, and added one more line. Don't think about home before 2,100 hours. It doesn't help and it slows down everything else. He had no idea whether he could actually follow that instruction. He was going to try. The village at dawn was different from the village of the previous afternoon. The afternoon's knothole had been in motion, purposeful, efficient, everyone doing something that needed doing. The dawn's knothole was something more private, the version of a place that existed before it put on its working face. Fires being restarted rather than stoked, people moving between structures with the slightly dazed quality of bodies that hadn't quite finished convincing their brains that the day was real. A pair of rabbits sitting outside a doorway drinking from cups and not talking, which felt like an intimacy Izuku was not sure he was meant to witness. He found water, a well and a washing station at the village's eastern edge, and cleaned up as efficiently as his injured arm allowed, then went looking for food and found Rotor, who was sitting outside the workshop eating something that looked like dense brown bread and appeared to be simultaneously rereading a set of technical notes that were covered in diagrams and corrections. Rotor was, Izuku estimated, somewhere between his own age and twice it, compact, built for practical work, with the kind of hands that spoke to someone who had spent a long time using them for things that required both strength and precision. He had a quality that Izuku recognized easily, having had it himself since early childhood, the quality of finding the world's technical details genuinely, unreservedly interesting, in a way that could not quite be turned off regardless of circumstances. He looked up from his notes when Izuku appeared, and there was a moment of recalibration in his expression, the same moment all of them had when they remembered the human in their village. That resolved into something that was cautious but leaning toward open. "Morning," he said. "There's bread on the table inside. Water's in the covered bucket, not the open one." "Thank you," Izuku said. He got his bread, dense, dark, nutty, the kind of bread that took serious commitment to eat but meant something regarding the skill and resource management of whoever had made it, and came back outside, because the morning light through the trees was doing something extraordinary, and he wanted to be in it. "You were taking notes yesterday," Rotor said. "On the workshop chimney, south-facing," Izuku said, without thinking. "Good draft and prevailing winds, keeps the workshop temperature stable in summer. I can tell whoever built it spent time observing seasonal airflow before they positioned it." Rotor looked at him for a long, assessing moment. "I built it," he said. "Then you spent time observing seasonal airflow first," Izuku said. Rotor made a sound that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same general territory. 14 months. We had a different one before that kept smoking us out." He turned back to his notes. "Then, what is it you do? Back where you're from. Besides the hero business." "Before the hero business, mostly study. Research into quirks, how they work, how they interact, theoretical applications. I used to fill notebooks." He gestured with his bread at the notebook visible in his front pocket. "I still fill notebooks." "Quirks," Rotor repeated, and there was something in the way he said it, tilting the unfamiliar word around in his mouth to find its weight. "That's the word for what you do. The lightning. It's a broad category. Any kind of ability that manifests biologically. Mine is called One for All. It's an energy amplification quirk that enhances physical abilities throughout the body. Strength, speed, the force of impacts. The lightning is a visible expression of the energy output." Rotor was writing this down, Izuku realized. He had opened his notebook, a different one from the technical diagrams, smaller, more battered, and was making notes with a focused speed that suggested he was not just noting what Izuku said but already placing it in a larger framework, drawing connections. "Does it have limits?" Rotor asked. "Significant ones. Too much output damages my body, the tissues and bones of my arms specifically, because that's where I direct most of the force. I've spent 2 years working on distribution methods to address it." He paused. "The short version is yes. All quirks have limits. The interesting question is usually what the limits are and how they can be worked around. That's how I think about engineering problems," Rotor said. "I know," Izuku said. "I noticed." Rotor looked up from his notes and studied him. "You notice a lot. Occupational habit." "Sorry, is it uncomfortable?" "No," Rotor said slowly. "No, actually. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. We don't get a lot of people here who are interested in the how of things. Sally thinks strategically and she's brilliant at it, but her focus is on the operational picture. Sonic doesn't really slow down long enough to analyze anything. Tails does, but he glanced toward the cluster of residential structures. He's 8. He shouldn't have to be the person I talk to about engineering theory." "No," Izuku said. "He shouldn't." They sat with that for a moment. The forest continued its dawn operation. "I'm sorry," Izuku said, because it felt true and relevant. "About what your world is." "About all of it." Rotor shrugged, the particular shrug of someone who had sat with their grief long enough that its shape had become familiar, if not smaller. "It's just what is," he said. "You learn to work inside it." "Yes," Izuku said. He knew about that too. Nicole was a small device, handheld, sleek in a functional rather than aesthetic way, with a screen that lit with shifting data and a voice that emerged from it with a quality that Izuku, after about 30 seconds of listening, stopped associating with the device and started associating with a person. "Good morning, Izuku Midoriya," she said, when Sally brought him to the small operations structure at the center of the village where she was apparently housed, or based, or present. The prepositions were all slightly wrong and he would need to work out the right ones. "Sally has asked me to provide you with a comprehensive briefing. I'll be as thorough as time allows." "Thank you," Izuku said, and he meant it, and he was already getting out his notebook. "I have a lot of questions." "I imagine so," Nicole said. "Shall I proceed in chronological order or would you prefer a thematic approach?" "Chronological first," Izuku said. "I always start with the history." Sally, who had been going to leave, stopped. She stood in the doorway and watched him settle at the table with his notebook open and his pen ready and his whole body oriented toward the information with the specific quality of attention that some people called focused and others called intense and which was, when you got down to it, simply Izuku being entirely himself. She stayed. Mobius had not always been broken. Nicole began at what she called the Long Peace, a period spanning several centuries before the villain whose name kept appearing in this history like a recurring wound had arrived, during which the various peoples of Mobius had organized themselves into kingdoms and city-states that were not always in harmony with each other but were, broadly, civilized. Conflicts happened. They were resolved. Things grew. The Kingdom of Acorn, to which the freedom fighters in this village were affiliated, had been among the most stable and longest-lived of these polities, its monarchy moderated by a council of advisors, its people engaged in the kind of slow, unglamorous accumulation of civic life that made for boring history and livable worlds. Izuku wrote, "Stable pre-authoritarian society. Institutional memory likely significant. Acorn monarchy has functional precedent, not symbolic." The war that had ended the Long Peace was called the Great War, and it was complicated in the way that wars between people who had legitimate grievances always were. Nicole walked him through the broad outlines without editorializing. Two peoples with contested territorial history and competing needs for resources, a series of diplomatic failures, a conflict that neither side had entirely planned and neither had known how to stop. The Kingdom of Acorn had been on one side. The war had ended with a treaty. The treaty had held, more or less, for a generation. What had not been adequately accounted for, Izuku noted, listening carefully, making connections Nicole had not drawn, was what the war did to the people who survived it, not the political aftermath, which had been handled. The human, or Mobian cost, the damage done to institutions and social trust that didn't show up in treaties or peace negotiations but that quietly undermined everything built afterward. Into that undermining had stepped a man named Ivo Robotnik. Nicole's voice when she described Robotnik was careful in a way that told Izuku she had her own relationship with what she was saying, that this was not purely historical information for her. She told him about a brilliant and unstable scientist who had once worked in service of the kingdom's technological development, who had proposed solutions that worked but came with costs no one had initially understood, who had leveraged the post-war exhaustion of the Acorn political establishment to position himself as indispensable until he was, and who had then, 5 years ago, in a coup that took less than 18 hours to complete, seized control of the kingdom's capital and the majority of its populated centers and declared himself the ruler of Robotropolis. The roboticization came next. Izuku's pen slowed on the page as Nicole explained it. He was not a soft person, you couldn't be, in his line of work, and survive, but the image of it assembled itself in his mind with a cold, detailed clarity that he found genuinely difficult to hold. Roboticization was a process. A technological one. It took a living person and it transformed them, their body, their biology, their physical self, into a machine. Not killed them. Transformed them. The person was still in there, somewhere inside the metal and the circuitry, aware enough to follow commands, not aware enough, in most cases, to resist. Sally's father, the king, had been roboticized early. It was one of Robotnik's first public demonstrations of the technology, and the political message of it was devastatingly clear. The people who had once been citizens of the Kingdom of Acorn and were now mechanical soldiers for the occupying power numbered in the thousands. Izuku put his pen down. The people who were roboticized, he said, Is it reversible? A pause. Current technical understanding suggests it may be possible under specific conditions, Nicole said. We have not yet been able to test the theory practically. What are the conditions? The zone of silence is the most significant complicating factor for the king's case. The process of deroboticization requires physical access to the individual and the destruction of the roboticization hardware, while leaving the organic components intact. We lack both the technology and the access point currently, but you're working on it. We are always working on it, Nicole said. Izuku picked up his pen and wrote, deroboticization, central long-term goal. Technical component, access component, political component all entangled. Approach must address all three simultaneously. He underlined it. Then, because he could not help himself, because his mind was already doing what it did, pulling apart problems, finding the load-bearing elements, looking for the angles that hadn't been tried. Who else is working on this? Beyond the freedom fighters? Another pause. This one had a different quality. There are other resistance cells in the wider territory, Nicole said. But Knothole is the most organized and the most technically capable. The other cells lack consistent access to resources and coordinated strategy. So you're the hub, Izuku said. In practice, yes. He looked up from his notebook at Sally, who had been standing in the doorway this entire time, and was now watching him with an expression he was starting to recognize. The one where she was making assessments. She wasn't going to share yet. You need a network, he said. I know, she said. A real one. Not just allied cells, an actual distributed network with shared information protocols and cross-coordination capability. So you're not reliant on Knothole being the single point of failure. I know, she said again, with the particular emphasis of someone who had been having this argument with herself and others for a long time. We're working on the resources to build it. What's the current limiting factor? She came all the way into the room and sat across the table from him. Mostly communications security. Robotnik signal interception is sophisticated. We can't transmit anything through his sensor network without risking exposure. She glanced at Nicole's screen. Nicole has been developing an encryption protocol, but it needs more processing power than we currently have access to. Izuku wrote something, then slid the notebook across the table so she could see it. She read it. What is that? A structure from my world. The Hero Commission uses something like this for secure interagency communication during major incidents. It's a distributed relay system that uses multiple low-power nodes to pass fragmented data so no single node carries enough information to be useful if intercepted. He tapped the diagram. It's not the same as your situation, but the principles might adapt. The key thing is that nothing is centralized. There's no one signal to intercept because there's no one signal. Sally looked at the diagram for a long moment. Then she looked at him. Where did you learn this? I read a lot, Izuku said. About everything. I started when I was 4 and I never really stopped. She looked at him for another beat. Then she picked up his notebook, carefully, with the particular respect of someone who understood what notebooks meant, and took it to Nicole. Can you analyze this? Already have, Nicole said. It's interesting. The briefing lasted until mid-morning. By the end of it, Izuku's notebook had 19 dense pages of notes, 3 structural diagrams, a rough timeline of Mobius's recent history, 7 outstanding questions marked with asterisks, and 1 small drawing of the Kingdom of Acorn's preoccupation capital that he'd asked Sally to describe from memory and had sketched while she talked, not because he needed it, but because she'd gotten a specific quality of quiet in her voice when she talked about it. And drawing gave him something to do with his hands that let him listen better. She noticed him doing it, and then noticed what he'd drawn, and was quiet for a moment. It's not accurate, he said. I've never seen it. I was working from your description. It's close, she said. The plaza in the center was larger. And there was a fountain. My father built it the year I was born. He said it was the most expensive thing in the kingdom, and also the most important. She looked at the sketch. I used to sit in the fountain in summer. I was told repeatedly not to. I did it anyway. Izuku smiled. You seem like someone who did things anyway. I seem like someone who had very good reasons for the things she did anyway, she said, with a precision that was its own kind of humor. He laughed. It came out easier than yesterday's had, which he noted as data. The mission came in the early afternoon. It was not, by the freedom fighters' standards, a major operation. A standard SWA bot patrol was moving through the eastern reach of the Great Forest, close enough to Knothole's outer perimeter to represent a reconnaissance risk, and Sonic wanted to deal with it before it could report anything useful back to Robotropolis. The plan was simple: disrupt the patrol, destroy the bots, withdraw before the signal could be logged. 20 minutes maximum? Izuku asked if he could come. He expected more resistance than he got. What he got was Sonic crossing his arms and giving him a long, sideways look, and then Sally saying, "Yes, but you stay with me and follow my operational calls," and Sonic making a noise that was not quite disagreement, and then dropping the subject. He was given a headset that connected to Nicole's network. He checked his arm, ran a quick assessment of his quirk at 15%, functional, a little ragged at the edges, and followed them into the trees. The patrol was 6 SW8 bots moving in a loose chevron formation through a section of the forest where the undergrowth was thin enough for their sensors to operate effectively. They were roughly the size of adult humans, metallic, bipedal, with optical sensors mounted where a face would be and weapon systems on both arms. They moved with a mechanical efficiency that Izuku, who had spent 3 years studying how different threats moved and what that movement meant, read immediately as patrol optimization. They were running a search pattern, covering ground methodically, sensor sweeps at regular intervals. He noted the sweep interval. It was 17 seconds. He noted the gap in coverage between the third and fourth bots in the formation. He noted the slight degradation in the leading bot's sensor arc, something in the left optical unit, running at reduced efficiency, creating a blind spot roughly 40 degrees wide on the approach vector. He noted all of this in about 4 seconds and then filed it. Sally, crouched beside him behind a broad root system with Nicole in her hand, was watching the patrol and counting under her breath. In the trees above and to the right, Sonic was a blue blur that hadn't fully resolved yet, holding position. On the left approach, Antoine had his sword in hand and was very carefully not letting his anxiety show in his posture, which told Izuku he'd been working on that for a long time. Tails was overhead, not fighting today, but providing an elevated observation point that fed data back to Nicole. "On my mark," Sally said quietly into the headset. "Sonic goes first. High-speed pass, take the 2 forward bots. Antoine and I take the flanks." "Rotor," jamming their signal relay, Rotor's voice came back through the headset, from somewhere deeper in the forest with his equipment. 30-second window starting from your mark. Good. A pause. Mark. Sonic became real. That was the only way Izuku could describe it, the way a figure that had been a held potential suddenly actualized, and the front 2 SW8 bots stopped existing as functioning units in the span of about half a second. There was a crack of displaced air, 2 sharp metallic impacts, and then Sonic was somewhere else and the bots were in pieces. Antoine moved left, and Izuku could see now that he was genuinely good. The anxiety in his posture was not a lack of skill but the honest acknowledgement that skill and danger were not the same thing, and he was doing something quite precise with his sword that took advantage of the remaining SWA bot's momentary distraction. Sally moved right, and she was different in action than she was at the strategy table. Faster, decisive, no wasted movement, the device in her left hand doing something to the bot's systems that Izuku filed for later study. The bot seized, its weapon's arm dropping, and she finished it with a compact, efficient strike to its central processing unit. That left one. The 6th bot, at the trailing edge of the formation, had registered the destruction of its companions and was running a threat assessment. Izuku could see it in the way its optical sensors were sweeping, the slight recalibration of its stance, and it was going to begin transmitting a distress signal in approximately 8 seconds, which was 5 seconds longer than Rotor's jamming window had remaining. He moved before he fully decided to. 15% one for all, directed entirely into his legs, not his arms, careful of the damage, using only the lower body distribution method he'd been developing. He was at the bot's blind spot in 2 steps, inside its optical coverage, before it had completed the threat assessment sweep, and then he planted his feet and hit it with both palms in a controlled strike that was not explosive enough to scatter debris but was enough, more than enough, to crumple its central housing and drop it. He stepped back. The bot was a heap of metal on the forest floor. The forest was very quiet. He turned around. Sally was standing 6 meters away with an expression that was doing its level best to stay neutral and not quite managing it. Behind her, Antoine was staring at him with his mouth slightly open. From the trees above, Tails was descending on his twin tails with the expression of someone who had just seen something he needed to measure. Sonic dropped out of the tree canopy to his right and stood with his hands on his hips, head tilted, looking at the downed bot and then at Izuku and then at the bot again. Huh, Sonic said. I saw the timing gap, Izuku said, because he felt he should explain. The jamming window was closing and the bot was about to transmit. I was in the best position to reach it in time. He paused. I should have said something first. I didn't consult the plan. I'm sorry, in my world, we're trained to call our moves, but this was fast and You took out a SWA bot in 2 seconds, Tails said, with the specific wonder of an engineer who had just gotten new performance data. Without hurting your arm. The force distribution, legs only, Izuku said. I've been working on the method. Arms are compromised right now, so I adapted. You adapted mid-mission, Sally said. Was that wrong? I can debrief on the decision-making if it helps with future planning. It wasn't wrong, she said, and her voice had a quality he didn't know what to do with. Something that wasn't approval exactly but was in the direction of it. Something more personal than a tactical assessment. It was right. You read the timing correctly, and you responded correctly. She looked at the down bot, then back at him. You didn't hesitate. I can't afford to, Izuku said. In my work, hesitation in the field means someone gets hurt. He paused. Usually me, honestly, but still. Antoine made a sound that was definitely a laugh, quickly suppressed. Sonic was still looking at him. The sideways, evaluating quality of the look was still there, but something else had joined it. Something that was not quite respect yet, but was considering the idea. Not bad, Sonic said. For a human. Thank you, Izuku said, with complete sincerity, because he meant it. The debrief happened by the central fire that evening. The group gathered with food in various stages of completion. The relaxed but focused energy of people who had come through something successful and were processing it in real time. Rotor had retrieved the SWA bot components, or as many as he could carry, and was already sorting them at the workshop table nearby, separating salvageable parts from damaged ones with the organized optimism of someone who saw potential rather than wreckage. The optical unit degradation on the lead bot, Izuku said. When Rotor mentioned he noted it in the debris. Is that common? Where on the sensor systems? Maintenance intervals, Rotor said. Robotnik's production lines prioritize quantity. The maintenance protocols are not what they could be, so there may be systematic sensor degradation across the patrol network. Izuku was already writing. If you had access to maintenance records or production data, you could predict the degradation patterns and build patrol disruption plans around the windows of maximum sensor limitation. Rotor looked at him with an expression that suggested he had not previously considered that this data existed in a usable form. Nicole, he said. Can we cross-reference patrol incident data with already building the model, Nicole said, from Sally's device. Give me until tomorrow morning. Sally was watching Izuku again. He noticed. He couldn't not notice. She was not subtle about the fact that she was paying careful attention. She just had a very controlled face, so you couldn't always read what the attention was producing. And this time he watched her back, which was a thing he'd been doing less of because it felt like overstepping, but which felt, in this moment, like something that might be allowed. She held his gaze for a beat. Then she looked back at her food. He looked back at his notebook. You're going to run out of pages, Tails said, appearing at his elbow with the particular stealth of a very small person who was used to moving around adults without being noticed. I have 3 more notebooks in my utility belt, Izuku said. I always carry spares. Tails looked at this as though it were one of the most sensible things anyone had ever said. I keep spares of everything important too, he said. Sonic says it's because I don't trust anything not to break. Is he wrong? Tails thought about it. No, he admitted. Izuku smiled. Sit down, he said. Tell me about how Nicole works. I've been trying to figure it out from observation, but I think I'm missing something fundamental. Tails sat down with the alert, eager quality of someone who had been waiting to be asked this question his entire life. It was past dark when the fire burned down to coals and people drifted toward sleep, Antoine said goodnight with a formality that was less defensive than the day before. A small shift, the kind that meant something. Rotor said goodnight without looking up from the SWE bot parts, which was Rotor's version of warmth. Tails fell asleep at the table over a diagram of Nicole's architecture that he'd been sketching for Izuku, and Sonic picked him up with a gentleness so practiced it was clearly unconscious and carried him toward the residential cluster without being asked. Izuku watched this, and wrote in his notebook, Sonic and Tails. The relationship is foundational to the whole group's cohesion. Sonic may be more invested in what happens here than his presentation suggests. Do not mistake performance of detachment for actual detachment. He closed the notebook. He was going to go to his structure. He had been told to rest, and he recognized the wisdom of this even when rest felt like waste. But the river was visible from the eastern edge of the village, catching the moonlight through the trees, and something about it pulled him there instead. He sat on the bank with his knees to his chest and his notebook on his thighs and watched the water move. The larger moon was high now. The smaller, bluer one was rising from the east, following its strange elliptical path. He had started, over the last 2 days, to stop finding the two moons unsettling and to simply find them present, which was not the same as home, but was something. I had a feeling you'd be here, Sally said from behind him. He turned. She was there, standing at the edge of the tree line, holding 2 cups, the same 2 cups as last night, the same tea, the same quiet offering. She moved forward when he turned and sat beside him on the bank without asking, which he noted because it was different from the deliberate, assessed quality of most of her movements. This one was just immediate. Like she'd decided before she got there. I wanted to tell you something, she said, handing him a cup. About today. The mission? What you did on the mission, and what you did this morning with Nicole, and what you did with Rotor before that. She looked at the river rather than at him, and her voice had the quality of someone choosing words with specific care. I make decisions about people fairly quickly. It's a function of operating in the kind of environment where the cost of being wrong about someone is very high. I understand, Izuku said. My assessment of you, coming into yesterday, was capable, possibly dangerous, unknown alignment, likely sincere, but sincerity can be performed. She paused. My assessment of you now is different. Different how? She looked at him. Her eyes in the moonlight were dark and direct, the eyes of someone who spent a great deal of time seeing things clearly and had stopped flinching from what was there. You have been here for less than 2 days, she said, and you have already improved our intelligence model, contributed to 3 tactical approaches we hadn't considered, built a genuine connection with Tails and Rotor, and neutralized the patrol unit under pressure without endangering anyone else. She paused. That's not performance. Performance falls apart under pressure. You held together under pressure. Izuku looked at his tea. He could feel the specific embarrassment of being praised, not because it was unwelcome but because he had never quite learned what to do with it. I was just doing what I know how to do, he said. Trying to be useful. Why? She asked. He looked at her. Sorry? Why is that the thing you try to be? Useful. You're in a world you've never seen, with people you don't know, in a situation that has no clear resolution. Most people in that situation would be focused on themselves, on finding a way home. She wasn't challenging him. The question was genuine, the tone of someone who wanted to understand. Why is your first impulse to help us? He thought about how to answer that. He thought about a younger version of himself, standing in front of a television, watching a video of a hero carry hundreds of people to safety in a single motion, and the particular, wordless, overwhelming feeling that had moved through him, that had structured everything he'd become after. I used to say it was about wanting to be a hero, he said finally. Which was true, but it wasn't the whole thing. The whole thing is that I've never been able to watch someone need help and do nothing. It doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like the alternative isn't something I can be and still be myself. He stopped. That probably sounds like something I rehearsed. It doesn't, she said. I think it comes from. He paused, because this was the part he didn't usually say, the part that lived under the hero theory and the tactical analysis and all the notebooks. I think it comes from when I was younger, when I didn't have a quirk and couldn't help anyone, and I would watch things happen that I should have been able to stop and I couldn't, and that feeling, he shook his head. I spent a lot of years trying to become someone that feeling didn't fit anymore. Someone who could always do something. Sally was very still beside him. Did it work? She asked. Mostly, he said. Mostly I can do something now. And on the days I can't, I can at least try. She was quiet for a while after that. The river ran over its stones, patient and consistent, the way rivers were. The two moons crossed each other's paths in the sky above. My father used to say, she said eventually, and her voice had the particular quality that names do when they carry very large weights, that leadership was just service that had been formalized. That a king was a person who had agreed to put their particular kind of capacity at the disposal of their people, permanently, without conditions. She paused. I thought that was a very idealistic definition when I was young, and now I've been doing it long enough that I think it might be accurate. She looked at the moons. I also think it might be the hardest thing in the world. Yeah, Izuku said. It is. The fire behind them had gone to coals. The village was sleeping. The forest breathed around them both, around the girl who had been born to serve a kingdom and the boy who had been born to serve an idea of what people could be, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and that, too, was something. Later, in his structure, Izuku opened his notebook to the page that said Day 2 and added, at the bottom, below all the tactical observations and the structural diagrams and the 17 asterisked questions, the freedom fighters are extraordinary. Each of them is carrying something enormous, and they carry it without complaint, as a matter of course. The way you carry things when you have been carrying them long enough that you've stopped thinking of it as a weight, and started thinking of it as just what you do. Sally Acorn is going to change this world back into what it was supposed to be. I don't know yet how much I can help with that. But I am going to try. I would very much like to try. He underlined the last line. Then he put the notebook away, lay back, and for the first time since the rift, slept without dreaming of home. Sonic the Hedgehog was not, by nature, a person who sat still. This was not a personality trait so much as a physical condition. At rest, his body was generating energy it had nowhere productive to go, and the result was a chronic, buzzing dissatisfaction that he managed through movement the way other people manage difficult feelings through talking, or eating or throwing things. The fastest thing alive, according to anyone who had ever tried to keep up with him, did not do well with stillness. He was sitting still now. On the roof of the workshop, in the dark, with his knees up and his arms resting on them, watching the light and the structure at the edge of the residential cluster go out. Tails found him there because Tails always found him. The kid had some kind of sonic location instinct that no amount of practice at actually being stealthy had ever successfully defeated. You're doing the thing, Tails said, pulling himself up to sit beside him. I'm not doing the thing. You're watching the new person's window and being quiet about having feelings. That's the thing. Sonic considered denying this. He's fast, he said instead. Not me fast, but faster than anything I've seen from a human. And he thinks fast too. You see how he figured out the patrol timing gap? I saw it around the same time and I've been doing this for years. He said he studies a lot, Tails said. Yeah, I noticed. Sonic was quiet for a moment. You like him. He explained 3 different structural engineering principles to me this afternoon that I'd been trying to work out from first principles for months, Tails said, with the simple directness of someone who found the connection between information and affection completely obvious. Of course I like him. Sonic made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Sally's taking him seriously. Sally takes everything seriously. Not like this. He was quiet. The light in Izuku's window had been out for several minutes now. She stayed for the whole briefing. She never stays for the whole briefing. She sets it up, and then she goes and does 6 other things while Nicole runs it. Tails absorbed this. Is that a problem? No, Sonic said, without enough conviction to be convincing. Then I don't know. He stopped. Picked up a small piece of bark from the roof, turned it over in his hands. He's not a problem. That's sort of the problem. He's annoyingly not a problem. Tails thought about this with the patience of someone who had spent 8 years translating Sonic's emotional subtext into legible language. You wanted something to be wrong with him, he said, so you'd have a reason to not worry about what happens when he has to leave. Sonic looked at him. You do this, Tails said gently. Every time we get close to someone, You find something wrong with them first. So it doesn't hurt as much when things change. Sonic said nothing. There's nothing wrong with him, Tails said. He's just good. Genuinely good. He paused. I think we should let him help us. Yeah, Sonic said after a moment. Yeah, I know. He stood up, because sitting still had reached its limit. Don't tell him I said any of this. Obviously, Tails said. Sonic dropped off the roof and was gone into the dark before he finished falling. By the end of the first week, Izuku had filled 2 notebooks. Established a working relationship with Rotor that involved spending 3 hours each morning in the workshop while Rotor explained the mechanical systems they'd built and Izuku cross-referenced them with engineering principles from his world, each of them occasionally stopping to say, "Oh, that's," the sound of one mind recognizing something in another. He had contributed 4 structural improvements to the workshop's ventilation system, 2 to the water filtration setup, and 1 to the food storage insulation that Rotor estimated would extend their cold storage window by 3 weeks per season. He had also, more quietly, more personally, sat with Antoine one evening and asked, genuinely and without agenda, about the village's supply chain for materials they couldn't produce themselves. Antoine had been defensive at first, the specific defensiveness of someone who expected to be dismissed. But Izuku had asked the questions of someone who found the whole problem genuinely interesting, and Antoine, who knew a great deal about Knothole's operational logistics that nobody ever asked him about, had eventually, carefully, begun to answer. The conversation had run 2 hours. At the end of it, Antoine had said good night, Midoriya, with a particular formality that Izuku was beginning to understand was Antoine's version of warmth. He had, in those same 7 days, participated in 3 more patrol disruption missions, been assigned a headset of his own by Nicole, who had noted, without being asked, that his timing pattern contributed to 23% improved outcome metrics across the missions she'd modeled, and been shown around the entirety of Knothole by Tails, who had opinions about every structure and was delighted to share them. He had written 19 letters to his mother, his friends, and All Might that he could not send. He had sat by the river each night. Sally had joined him most of those nights. Not everyone, she had too much work, always, and there were nights when the lights in the operations structure burned until very late, and he saw her silhouette moving against them when he passed on his way to sleep. But most nights she came, with tea or without, and they talked, or they didn't, which was a different kind of conversation. The kind you could only have with someone once you'd established that the silence between you was safe. He had learned, she read voraciously, mostly history and political theory, from a small collection of books the village had rescued during the occupation's early days. She had opinions about Mabian governance that were more complicated than her official position as princess-in-waiting suggested. She questioned the monarchical model, thought the council structure had been the kingdom of Acorn's strongest institutional element, believed that whatever came after the liberation should probably look different from what had come before. She told him this not as a confession but as a position, the way you stated a position to someone you expected to engage with it rather than simply accept it. He engaged with it. He told her about Japan's hero licensing system and its failures, the ways that putting individual heroism at the center of a public safety model created accountability gaps and left civilian communities dependent on people who were ultimately individual actors with individual motivations. He talked about the debates he'd heard at the commission level, the alternative models being proposed, the things he himself would change if he were designing it from scratch. He was saying some of these things out loud for the first time, he realized, things he thought but had no one in his world to fully think them with, not without feeling like he was criticizing something that people he loved had given everything to. Sally listened with her whole attention, which was the most comprehensive form of listening he had ever encountered. You've thought about these systems seriously, she said on the 4th night. Not just as a hero. As someone who thinks about how societies are structured. I can't separate them, he said. The systems are why heroes exist. If the systems were different, heroes would be different too. He paused. Or might not need to exist the same way at all. That's a brave thing to admit, if you've built your life around being one. Maybe, he said. But I'd rather be right than comfortable. She had looked at him with an expression that he had filed, in the growing internal database of things he didn't know what to do with yet, under something like the way someone looks when they recognize something they had been beginning to think was rare. He had looked away, at the river, and thought about practical things until the feeling settled. The moon, both of them, traced their paths, patient and unconcerned, overhead.